On a single morning in late October 1929, chaos swallowed Wall Street. Billions in wealth evaporated before lunchtime. Trading floors shook as a record-breaking flood of shares hit the market. Phones jammed, messages failed, and brokers were cut off from the outside world. It was the day the American dream cracked and the global economy began to crumble. We imagine a collapse of such magnitude must have been a force of nature, an inevitable storm brewed from complex global currents. But the truth is far more personal and far more terrifying. The trigger was not a what, but a who. His name was Charles Edwin Mitchell. To the world, he was Sunshine Charlie, America's most popular banker, a man whose smile promised a share of the endless American dream. But beneath that radiant confidence lay a single decision, a choice made in a moment of supreme pressure that would set a fuse to the global financial system. This is not just a story of numbers and graphs. It is a story of human psychology, of ambition, and of a delusion so contagious it brought the world to its knees. To understand the fall, you must first understand the dizzying height. The 1920s in America were not just prosperous. They were a revolution, the Roaring Twenties. Imagine a nation intoxicated by its own genius. Skyscrapers clawed at the heavens, each new floor a testament to unshakable confidence. Ford's assembly lines churned out automobiles, making the open road a new symbol of freedom. Radios crackled to life in living rooms, weaving the nation together with the syncopated rhythms of jazz. It was an age of the first talking pictures, the first transatlantic flight, the first sense that prosperity was not a phase, but a permanent state of being. In this carnival of progress, the stock market became the main attraction. But it was an exclusive club. Before Charles Mitchell, owning stocks was the privilege of the elite, the robber barons, the old money families, the industrial titans. Less than 1% of the population participated. For the average American, a savings account was the pinnacle of financial sophistication. The dizzying gains on Wall Street were a spectator sport, a story they read about in the papers. Charles Mitchell saw this divide not as a tradition, but as an opportunity. A man of humble origins from a Massachusetts farm, he possessed a burning ambition that mirrored the nation's own. When he took the helm of the National City Bank in 1919, he didn't see a state institution for safeguarding wealth. He saw a dormant engine of mass financial persuasion. He had a revolutionary and ultimately catastrophic idea. What if every American could be a capitalist? His mantra was seductive. Why should wealth belong only to the wealthy? He would ask. In 1920, he brought this vision to life by creating the National City Company, a subsidiary with one mission: sell stocks to the masses. He turned bank lobbies, once hushed halls of marble and conservatism, into bustling sales floors. When a farmer came to deposit his harvest earnings, he was offered a piece of General Motors. When a teacher came to open a savings account, she was sold a dream partnership with American Telephone and Telegraph. Mitchell was a savant of sales psychology. He understood that he wasn't selling shares in a company. He was selling a narrative of future free from financial worry. His salesmen were not mere clerks. They were dream merchants, trained in a new art of financial persuasion. They used powerful, emotional language. Mr. Johnson, do you really want to work for someone else your entire life? Or, Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford. Don't you want to be an owner? The advertising was relentless and brilliant. Full-page spreads showed smiling families in front of sprawling homes with captions like, "This could be your life. Invest just $15 a month." Newspapers ran testimonials from a Cleveland secretary who supposedly retired early, or a streetcar driver who bought a new home with his dividends. The message was clear. The stock market was a guaranteed elevator to the good life. But Mitchell's true masterstroke was the mechanism that made it all possible: buying on margin. This was the financial equivalent of a superpower, and its seduction was irresistible. Here's how it worked. An investor only needed to put down 10% of a stock's price. The bank would loan them the remaining 90%. Imagine you have $100. With margin, you could buy $1,000 worth of stock. If that stock rose just 10% to $1,100, you could sell it, pay back the bank's $900, and walk away with $200, doubling your money. The salesman made it sound like alchemy. Your money in the bank earns 5% a year. Your money in the market can earn 100% in 6 months. The effect was volcanic. The number of Americans in the stock market exploded from 500,000 to 10 million in less than a decade. A mechanic in Detroit would invest 6 months' salary. A farmer in Kansas would sell his livestock. A widow in Ohio would mortgage her home, all to buy into the dream Mitchell was selling. The volume of margin loans ballooned from $2 billion to a staggering $8.5 billion. Charles Mitchell was hailed as a financial prophet, a democratizer of wealth. He was in 1928 the highest-paid banker in America, earning the modern equivalent of $20 million. He stood at the pinnacle of the world he had created, bathed in the glow of universal admiration. But high atop this pyramid of paper profits, the first, almost imperceptible, cracks were beginning to show. The illusion was perfect, the party was in full swing, and Charles Mitchell was the undisputed king of Wall Street. But in the spring of 1929, a quiet warning was issued, one that would force Mitchell to make a choice. The decision he was about to make wouldn't just break the market, it would break the world. And this is where the video takes a shocking turn. The point of no return. The warning came not from a fringe doomsayer, but from the heart of the American financial system itself, the Federal Reserve. By the spring of 1929, a few cautious voices within the Fed's marble halls were growing deeply alarmed. The numbers no longer added up. Stock prices were soaring into the stratosphere, completely detached from the company's actual profits or the health of the underlying economy. Major corporations were trading at price-to-earnings ratios of 15-1, a level that today would scream speculative. Bubble. The Fed saw the terrifying mathematics of margin debt. They understood that the entire boom was built on a foundation of borrowed money. If 90% of the money in the market is loaned, then a mere 10% drop in prices would wipe out the entire equity of millions of investors, forcing them to sell. That selling would cause prices to fall further, triggering more forced selling, a self-perpetuating death spiral. On February 6, 1929, the Federal Reserve issued a stock directive to banks across the country. Stop the reckless lending for stock speculation. Rein in margin loans. The goal was to gently let the air out of the bubble before it exploded. The market, addicted to easy money, shuddered. In early March, stock prices began to tumble. The loss figures were in the billions. The first icy trickle of panic began to seep through the cracks in the bullish facade. For a few tense days it seemed the fever might break, that sanity might return. This was the moment of truth for Charles Mitchell. His entire empire, his reputation, his life's work was built on the perpetual motion machine of speculation. A retreat now would mean admitting his revolutionary system was flawed. It would mean massive losses for his bank and its millions of new investor clients. The pressure was immense. On March 12, 1929, Mitchell made his choice. He called an impromptu press conference, the flashbulbs popping off his determined face. With the confidence of a general, he delivered a line that was a direct declaration of war on the Federal Reserve. He declared, "The National City Bank will provide the market with all the liquidity it needs. We will not allow an unnecessary crisis to occur." The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. Newspapers ran with triumphant headlines. "Sunshine Charlie saves the market." The slide reversed itself with violent force. In a single week, the market not only recovered its losses but blasted through to new, previously unimaginable heights. Mitchell was celebrated as a hero, a titan who had stared down the timid bureaucrats and won. But this was no salvation. This was the fatal injection of adrenaline into a dying patient's heart. By publicly vowing to fuel the very speculation the Fed was trying to curb, Mitchell had effectively called the Fed's bluff and won. He had removed the last element of fear from the market. The resulting frenzy in the summer of 1929 was the final, manic phase of the delirium. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rocketed to a peak of 381, a record that would stand, unbroken for a quarter of a century. 3 million new investors rushed in, desperate not to miss the easy money. The stories became legend. Shoeshine boys and taxi drivers offered hot stock tips. Wives secretly pawned family heirlooms to buy another 100 shares of RCA. The market was no longer a place for investment. It was a national gambling hall, and everyone had a seat. Behind the scenes, however, the smart money was quietly exiting. Astute investors like Joseph P. Kennedy, the future president's father, saw the writing on the wall. He later famously remarked that he knew it was time to get out when he received stock tips from his shoeshine boy. The insiders, the large investment trusts, the old money families understood the precariousness of the structure Mitchell had built. They began selling off their holdings in quiet, methodical blocks, careful not to spark the panic they knew was inevitable. The gap between the stock market and economic reality had become a chasm. Industrial production was slowing. Consumer debt was soaring. The agricultural sector was already in a depression. The market, hopped up on Mitchell's liquidity, simply ignored it all. The stage was now set. The pendulum, pushed to its absolute extreme by Mitchell's fateful decision, had run out of room. All that was needed was a single, coordinated push. The market was at its giddy, irrational peak, and Charles Mitchell was the hero of the hour. But the very people he had made rich were about to turn on him in the most devastating way possible. What happens next is a chain reaction of panic and collapse that most people never hear the full story of, and that's the real danger. The domino effect. The push came in October. The smart money was gone. The economic indicators were flashing red. And on the morning of October 24, 1929, a day that would be seared into history as Black Thursday, several of New York's largest investment trusts made a coordinated, cold-blooded decision. It was time to exit completely. They unleashed a tidal wave of sell orders. At first, the ticker tape just showed a slight dip, then a stumble, then a freefall. The numbers on the tape began to lag behind the actual chaos on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The scene descended into a surreal nightmare. Men in expensive suits, their faces etched with a terror they had never known, screamed sell orders across the trading pit. Paper confetti of thrown tickets rained down from the gallery. The noise was a constant, deafening roar of pure fear. The infrastructure itself began to fail. The volume of trades was so immense a record 13 million shares would be sold that day, 5 times the normal amount that the telephone system, the lifeline of the market, became completely overwhelmed. Brokers were cut off from their clients. Communication with the outside world slowed to a trickle and then stopped. It was as if the heart of American finance had suffered a catastrophic attack and the body was shutting down. This was the moment the Mitchell-engineered domino effect began, and the dominoes were not made of wood, but of human lives and borrowed money. The first domino fell. Plummeting stock prices triggered margin calls. Banks that had loaned 90% of the stock's value now saw their collateral evaporating. They sent out frantic telegrams and made desperate phone calls to investors. Your stocks are no longer sufficient collateral. You must immediately pay us more money to secure your loan. The second domino fell. The mechanic from Detroit, the teacher from Ohio, the farmer from Kansas, they had no more money. They had invested everything they had and borrowed far more. The only way to answer the margin call was to sell their stocks to raise cash. The third domino fell. This forced mass selling drove prices down even further, which triggered more margin calls for more people. It was a vicious, self-feeding cycle. A falling price caused selling, which caused more falling prices. The pyramid of debt was collapsing in on itself. The fourth domino fell. The banks themselves began to teeter. They had loaned out millions upon millions of dollars that were now gone, vaporized. The stocks they held as collateral were worthless. Smaller banks, who had embraced Mitchell's speculative model most enthusiastically, were the first to close their doors. When a bank closed, it didn't just take down speculators. It took the life savings of every ordinary depositor who had simply trusted them with their money. The human tragedies mounted, each one a stark counterpoint to the carefree propaganda of the Roaring Twenties. Edward Hopkins, the Detroit mechanic, had put his entire $5,000 life savings into Ford stock. By November, it was worth $200, and the bank was demanding $3,000 he did not have. He was found in his garage. Mary Field, the Ohio teacher, had mortgaged the family home to buy into the radio boom. The bank foreclosed, and 3 generations of her family were put out on the street with nothing. The following Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, was the final apocalyptic crash. There was no hope left, only blind, frantic liquidation. Americans lost $14 billion in a single day, a sum greater than the entire cost of World War I for the United States. The Brooklyn Bridge became a grim symbol of despair, as men who had been paper millionaires just weeks before ended their lives there, their shattered dreams falling into the East River. And where was Sunshine Charlie during the collapse? He was in his office, reportedly still trying to organize buying pools to stem the tide, a king trying to command the ocean. But the trust was gone, the spell was broken. The man who had promised endless prosperity was now watching the world he built turn to ash. Rehook. The crash was complete, and the financial devastation was unimaginable. But the story doesn't end on the floor of the stock exchange. The economic earthquake had just hit, and the political and social tsunami it triggered was about to rewrite the American social contract in ways that might completely change how you see this topic. The aftermath and the echo. In the years that followed, the Great Depression settled over America like a permanent gray winter. The numbers are still staggering to comprehend. 25 million people unemployed, 1 in 4 workers. 5,000 banks shuttered forever, wiping out the life savings of millions. 2 million Americans were homeless, forced into squalid shantytowns that they bitterly named Hoovervilles after the president they blamed. Suicides increased by 30%. In the nation that had considered itself the richest on earth, lines for free bread stretched for blocks. The public needed a villain, and they found one in Charles Mitchell. In 1933, he was dragged before a congressional hearing, a spectacle meant to assign blame for the catastrophe. The atmosphere was charged with fury. Senator Carter Glass, architect of the Federal Reserve System, fixed Mitchell with a withering gaze and asked the question on the mind of a nation: do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families? Mitchell's defense was a masterpiece of deflection. He showed no remorse. I wanted to give people the opportunity to get rich, he insisted. No one forced them to buy stocks. He was a salesman, and he had sold the American people a dream. He never acknowledged that the dream was, in fact, a carefully constructed trap. Justice, however, found a way. In 1933, the same year as his congressional testimony, Mitchell was prosecuted not for crashing the economy, but for a more mundane crime: tax evasion. He was found to have dodged $850,000 in taxes. Forced to resign in utter disgrace, the man once called Sunshine Charlie became a permanent symbol of the reckless greed of the 1920s. The political backlash was swift and transformative. The government was determined to ensure that no single banker could ever wield such destructive power again. In 1933, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act, a law that erected a solid wall between commercial banking, safeguarding people's deposits, and investment banking, gambling in the markets. The goal was simple: never again would a banker be able to use the life savings of ordinary people as chips for high-stakes speculation. But the government's response went even further, into a realm that would have been unthinkable just years before. In a move of sheer economic desperation, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in April 1933, signed an executive order that confiscated the private gold of American citizens. The order made it a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment for any individual to own gold coins, bullion, or certificates. Every American was compelled to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve at the fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. This was a profound violation of property rights, a desperate gambit to break the deflationary spiral. As long as people could demand gold for their dollars, the government's ability to print money and stimulate the economy was limited. By taking the gold, the government seized control of the nation's monetary base. Within a month, Americans surrendered over 3,600 tons of gold. Then, in a stunning move, the government raised the official price of gold to $35 an ounce. The state had just made a 70% profit on the wealth it had confiscated from its people. Charles Mitchell spent his remaining years in obscurity, a ghost of the Gilded Age. He worked as a consultant in Europe and later ran a small investment firm in the US, a phantom haunting the ruins of the world he helped destroy. He died in 1955, never admitting his responsibility. His story is a chilling lesson in the law of unintended consequences. Mitchell genuinely believed he was a democratizer, a financial messiah for the common man. But his system, built on the seductive poison of easy credit and mass speculation, lacked the essential ingredient of a stable market: fear. By intervening in March 1929, he destroyed that fear, and in doing so, he removed the market's only immune system. Today, the echoes are deafening. We live in a new era of financial democratization. Over 50 million Americans trade stocks through apps on their smartphones. The volume of margin debt has reached a staggering $900 billion. New platforms promise commission-free trading, gamify investing, and sell the same narrative Mitchell did. Everyone should be an investor. A new generation pours savings into volatile cryptocurrencies and meme stocks, often using borrowed money, convinced that this time is different. The psychological patterns are identical: the belief in a perpetual bull market, the disdain for caution, the allure of getting rich quick. The mechanism is the same. The question is, will the outcome be? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The story of Charles Mitchell is not a relic of the past. It is a warning. A warning about the seductive power of easy money, the danger of unchecked financial innovation, and the catastrophic potential of a single person's choice. The next time you hear promises of democratized wealth and effortless profits, remember Sunshine Charlie, remember the crash. And ask yourself one critical question: who, in the end, will truly profit? If this exploration of history's fragile financial moments resonated with you, if it made you think differently about the world of money and power, then subscribe to the channel. There are many more such stories ahead, and understanding them might just be the most important investment you ever make.